This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is 59 AD. We are in the Roman Empire. The emperor is Nero. A new book, Nero, Matricide, Music, and Murder in Imperial Rome. I welcome Anthony Everitt and Roddy Ashworth, the authors, to help me tell a story that is not believable, except there it is in the books. We begin with Nero and his mother, Agrippina. There's a dinner party. The dinner party consists of the important personages of these first 5 years of Nero's reign. Seneca, his teacher, Pompeia, his lover, future wife, Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, and Tacitus, who is a man who's responsible for a particular trireme. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you. Thank you for this. Anthony, I begin with you because this moment, this dinner party, arranged by Nero, he is planning to murder his mother. Do we know when he came up with that idea, and at this moment, why he came up with it? Good evening to you.
Good evening, and thank you very much for asking us. It's a great pleasure to be here. We can only speculate because 4 or 5 years passed without much incident, except that Agrippina was constantly annoying her son. The problem with Agrippina was that she didn't really understand her son, and she kept on pushing him to enter public life and to enjoy entering public life, to learn all the things you need to learn. And he resisted. He really wanted to race in chariots and listen to popular music and stuff like that, make it himself. So we don't really know, and we don't really know why. It must have been an accumulation of irritations.
The irritations, however, lead him to a murder plot that is indeed strange, using a trireme that is to fall apart while taking Agrippina back to her villa. The strange detail here is, why not poison? Why did he turn away from a weapon that his mother had perfected?
And which he himself used.
Yes.
He used poison himself. And in fact, the poison that he took with him in his last minutes got stolen by his domestic staff. So poison was in the air, certainly. Why he acted as he did, I don't really know. I suppose he thought he was holidaying near the fleet, and Tacitus was in charge of the fleet, and it would be a simple thing to do to get a trireme broken up. He had seen a theatre show where something similar happened in the sort of in the set that they call it of the play. So we're not sure, but he didn't tell anybody, any of his followers, apart from Tacitus.
So the dinner party.
And he didn't tell Burrus.
They
disapproved.
The dinner party did not know that he was planning to murder his mother.
No, not at all. Not at all.
And the way he did it, he had a trireme constructed so that it would fall apart once it hit the waves. He wanted to get away with it and not have anybody know that he'd done it. Is that the understanding, Anthony?
Well, I think that's right. But once he had done the murder, and it was generally known that the murder had been done and everybody guessed it was him, he then felt paralyzingly guilty and came out and more or less admitted by the plays that he chose to work in. He more or less admitted to his crime.
Let's go to the crime, because the trireme doesn't work. This is, you can't make this stuff up, okay? There's a lot of this in the telling of this story of Nero. When it falls apart, Agrippina, who is an extremely vigorous human being, swims away and doesn't call out, swims to shore, is rescued by fishermen, gets back to her villa. And Nero, fearful that she's survived in some fashion, he's waiting for word that she's dead, cannot call on the Praetorians because they're more loyal to his mother than they are to him. Exactly. So he turns to Tacitus, the Greek, and he sends Tacitus. The death scene, Anthony, the death scene, whose source do we have on the death scene when she says, when she pulls open her breast and says, to stab me in the womb that gave birth to him? Whose scene is that?
I think that's Suetonius.
And do we?
No, I think Suetonius and Tacitus mentioned it to tell the story, and it is an astonishing admission.
Yes, they're telling a story almost as if we're in a play. Do you feel that when you read these sources?
Yes, very much so, very much so. And the thing is that she is such a competent person. She is a very, very able politician. And her abilities stop, though, at the front door of her son. And she behaves extremely stupidly to him.
We need to know a great deal about Agrippina, but first I want to finish this episode because Anacetus takes a posse and he goes to the house and he murders Agrippina. And Nero immediately is grief-ridden, and he's also fearful. He's fearful that Rome will retaliate against him. He cowers. But the reactions of the Romans, how do they react, Anthony?
Well, they let it pass. I mean, they don't worry too much about it. It's the sort of thing that Nero might do. So, although he was terrified that there would be an uprising of some sort in favor of Agrippina, there wasn't.
Did he put out the story that she was planning to kill him?
That was probably put together by Seneca, who was a dab hand with writing scripts.
Oh, we need to pay attention to the rest of the dinner table here. Seneca is his tutor. He's a very famous Stoic. He's also an extremely rich man. He's a total contradiction. A man who is both a Sybarite and a Stoic at the same time. Was this commonplace in Rome, or was Seneca an exception?
I think it probably was something called the Stoic opposition, where to which aristocrats like Seneca tended to belong, and they bemoaned the state of affairs, but decided that they'd have to live with it in any event. And Seneca admitted in the open that his morals were purer in the word than they were in the deed.
Another member of the dinner party, Burrus, the leader of the Praetorians. Where does he come from, Anthony? Is it important, his personality? Because
he's just a plain soldier, and he was appointed because he wouldn't cause trouble. Because the head of the Praetorian Guard was in a very powerful position, because if he was clever, he could turn the guard on their employer.
The guard was loyal to Agrippina. Was Burrus loyal to Agrippina? If he'd known about the plot, would have he interrupted it?
He was loyal but didn't act. Both Seneca and Burrus, when they were told about the murder, just sighed and said, "We're very sorry to hear it."
Very sorry to hear. And Pompeia, she is an aristocrat.
She is.
And she is she's not yet his wife, I don't think. He's still married to Octavia,
Yes.
whom he was obliged to marry to give him a royal backdrop. What does Pompeia make of this plot? Do we think she knew it was happening?
We don't know, to be perfectly honest. I would have thought she might very well know, but we're not in fact told. We're hardly told about her presence there, but she was present.
She's a powerful
Her villa.
She's a very powerful human being, and we'll come back to her again, but we need to go back to where Agrippina came from. This woman who was murdered by her son with such a bizarre evening that led to Nero being liberated to be more of what he was, which is a total contradiction. I learned from the new book, Nero, Matricide, Music, and Murder in Imperial Rome. Everything you've heard about Nero needs to be updated, because the facts are far more bizarre and unpredictable. And a deal of that has to do with his mother, whom he murders when he's 22 years old. Let's go back to his breech birth in 37 AD. His father is named Barbus, meaning Bronzebeard. Agrippina will explore. Do we need to know anything about his father's personality, Anthony?
Not really about his father. What we do need to know is about his grandfather, Germanicus, who was enormously popular with the population, and in particular with the soldiery. So, and that was where the protection, if you like, that Agrippina always carried with her. the Praetorians and the soldiers were keen on the family.
I see. So it was Germanicus who was the popular figure, and that passed to Agrippina, his daughter. She's born in 15 Nero's born in 37 AD. It's a breech birth. There's a prophecy. Who knows, Anthony? Who knows whether these prophecies were written afterwards or before? But it's quite convincing. The prophecy is he'll be an emperor and he'll murder his mother. And his mother is said to have responded to the prophet, if he's emperor, I don't care about the rest. Well, you will someday. But she's born in 15 AD. Her father is Germanicus. Her mother is also named Agrippina. But you emphasize that she didn't derive her fiery personality from her mother. She got it from Livia. What did she get?
Oh, Livia was the very wise, very astute wife of Augustus, the first emperor. Livia is one of my favorite characters in all history. She knew how to get her way without seeming to do so. And for a few years, when Agrippina was in her teens, she stayed at Livia's house and she sat at Livia's feet, so to speak. She learned quite a lot from Livia. She learned above all about the virtue of patience, firmness and patience. Her mother was impatient and came to a grisly end. Agrippina was hoping that she wouldn't.
Yes, Agrippina's personality, we emphasize it here. It's forming in the 30s and in the 30s. And it's going to come to her taking charge of her own success. She wants to be the emperor. Was that unusual? Is she by herself as a woman who believes she can crash through the Roman ceremony and be princeps?
She couldn't, and she should have learned from Livia that you can have all the power you want, provided you don't claim it. And Agrippina, looking at her mother's record, seemed to take Livia's advice, but in fact, she was too keen on having the trappings of power, sitting on a tall dais with her son and all the rest of it, than she ought to have been.
She has a brother named whom we call Caligula, Little Boots. Yes. Caligula has a reputation that is maybe deserved here in the 21st century. But the important detail here is Agrippina is his sister. There are two other sisters, Drusilla and I'm sorry, I don't know the other name. And Caligula is jealous of them, competitive with them, dismissive of them. How does he treat his sisters?
Well, the story goes that he gets rather too close to them for comfort. But he brings them forward. He gives them unusual political privileges and so forth. They respond by plotting against him, it seems. Very odd story. Probably they saw that Caligula was unstable, mentally unstable, and they would be wise to distance themselves from him rather than be too much associated with what looked like a disastrous career.
Caligula is increasingly unpredictable, let's put it that way, in his brief reign, and he persecutes his own family. The way I saw him, Anthony, is he's almost a model for Nero. Did Nero know about his uncle?
Oh, yes, he will have done, as a dreadful warning.
The way he persecutes his family is that he exiles all of his sisters, and especially Agrippina, whom he puts on an island that is not uncomfortable, but is extremely boring. And she bears up on it, waiting for a better day. She survives, in other words. But again, that personality of hers is important because we're about to take her to the future when she makes a play to be the empress. But a detail about her and her education: were Roman daughters and wives led to understand that they needed to be educated? The men all read the Greeks. To the women?
The women are not taught the Greeks. Women are taught how to run a household.
And so,
But if they're clever women like Livia and like the younger Agrippina, they will have done some reading.
and Agrippina then is unusual as a Roman woman. This is not a model of a matriarch. This is a superior human being who intends, despite the fact that she's surrounded by family murder and violence and threats, she means to be emperor. Is that correct, Anthony, at this point in her life?
She means to be emperor through the emperor, through Nero. That's what she means to do. And she thinks she can get away with it. She's very good at compromise. She's very good at consultation. Whenever she's got a major policy development to announce, she spends some time talking to the relevant senators. I mean, she would have been brilliant in Congress. In Washington. I mean, she was a very good deal maker. However, however good a deal maker she was still a mother's daughter, and she tended to lose it in relation to Nero, her son. I mean, there's some claim that she wanted to have sex with her son as a way of keeping him under control. Not a very sort of plausible approach.
The murder of Tiberius, and it is a murder.
Yes.
He's dying slowly in Capri. He appears to be dead. He's not.
Yes.
You report that Caligula, who is being congratulated as the new emperor, alone by himself goes and suffocates Tiberius. Who's the source on that? Is that Tacitus again?
That'll be Tacitus, and it'll be Suetonius.
And
it'll be Dio too. It'll be Dio Cassius as well.
Do we trust it? It's such again, these things strike me as theater pieces sometimes.
Se non è vero è ben trovato. If it's not true, it's well found.
And do the Roman people know of these things? Is it widespread to understand that Caligula just stepped past Tiberius?
I don't know. I don't know. I would think that there was a fair amount of gossip around the Palatine Hill. And in Nero's time, Nero was so candid about his crimes in this extraordinary fashion that everybody knew exactly what he was up to.
And Caligula eventually meets an unhappy end as well. He's assassinated by what appears to be a member of the army. Yeah. Does Agrippina know about that plot? She's brought back from
exile. No, I don't think so. Caligula was very clever, but rather mad. After an illness he had, he seems not to have really a mental illness of some sort, meningitis or something of that kind, and he seems not to have recovered from it. And people were generally getting thoroughly upset by his antics.
The book is Nero, Matricide, Music, and Murder in Imperial Rome. We're spending time with Agrippina, Nero's mother, because that, well, modern psychology says that's everything. However, at the same time, Agrippina deserves attention because not only do we know that she's the daughter of three of the very famous and celebrated Germanicus, the daughter of Agrippina, Germanicus's wife. She is the granddaughter of, well, she descends from the Julian Claudian dynasties. They come together here at this time in the 30s and 40s. But she also has ambition to be princeps or near to princeps, to rule through the princeps, who's her son. But in order to do that, with Anabaris, her husband, gone, left the field, he's dead, she needs to marry Claudius, the new emperor who rises, we believe. Anthony, again, this is a mystery to me. Did Claudius know that Caligula was going to be assassinated? Was he part of it?
I think it's quite possible that he did, and that it was all a plot which involved him. But if so, it was very well handled, and we don't know. And we've not been told in so many words. By the way, I should just remind you that Claudius is Agrippina's uncle.
Agrippina's uncle, yes. But first he's married to Messalina. And we need to spend some time with Messalina just a moment, because she's another force of nature in Rome. Her force of nature seems to be to conquer men through sexuality. But at the same time, she humiliates Claudius all the time because of her many, they're not really affairs, they're trysts. and Claudius accepts it. What do we need to know about Claudius? Was he a weak man, a strong man? He's responsible for that second invasion of Britain, which
Because
is
because he was disabled, he was kept out of public life, and so he was given no training at all by Augustus and Livia and the other members of the family. So it was a complete surprise to most people when he emerged as emperor, and he wasn't about. He didn't have any military experience, which was usually rather a disaster. So Claudius was not weak, but he was rather eccentric because of his curious upbringing, and but in many ways he was rather a good ruler and had many achievements to his credit. For example, the development of the port at Ostia, so that he could cope with the economic demand.
And Messalina was a threat to him, but eventually she leaves the stage. And now we have a contest to see who will be the new Augustina, the new empress. And there are two rivals to Agrippina. I would never want to be a rival to Agrippina. She's ready to use witchcraft, poison, defamatory remarks. She takes on everyone around Claudius, including a previous wife, I think. One of the contestants had already been married to Claudius. And she wins through with this determination to join Claudius on the throne. What does Claudius make of her? Does he have an opinion? He writes a lot.
Well, you can't really tell, because once they're married, she is completely in charge, and you can't really burrow through to what his real feelings were, except perhaps towards the end. Right at the end, it looks as though he was beginning to come round to supporting his son Britannicus in a way that he'd not done before, and that alerted, set off alarm bells in Agrippina's mind, and it was that which led to the poisoning of Claudius. Yes. But until that, before we get there, Claudius, she was a very good manager of the Senate, as I was touching on earlier. She knew how to get things done. Once she was in command, the state ran very sweetly.
The detail here that we need to pay attention to is the education of Nero and his stepbrother, Britannicus. Britannicus is named for Claudius's supposed conquest of Britain. Claudius spent some time in Britain and he came back. Caligula, I understand, had set up the camp for the invasion, but he died. Well, he'd been assassinated. Claudius went through with it, and his son is Britannicus by Messalina. Now, that's a direct line to the future. That's a successor. Agrippina has to move Britannicus aside. The way the plot goes, Nero's a few years older. Is Nero, at this point, she hires Seneca for Nero? Is that correct, Anthony?
As tutor, yes, that's right. She wanted him to have the best possible education, and she wanted him trained in the art of governing. Seneca wrote a special essay called On Clemency, on Mercy, where he talks about the importance of calm and forgiveness of enemies and so forth, a general winding down of violence and in favor of propriety.
Britannicus and Nero are being educated together. Is Seneca also teaching Britannicus?
Probably, although maybe not in quite the same class, because Britannicus is a bit younger. One supposes, although we're not told in very much detail, that Nero went to school with some of his aristocratic sort of coevals and learned. He went through the usual curriculum. Seneca, however, was not old-fashioned. He has very advanced educational ideas. He thinks that people should enjoy themselves. He thinks they should be praised and patted on the back when they do well and so forth. Not habits known for Roman education.
A detail about how Claudius regards Nero. He adopts him. Is that as good as being the son of, to be adopted by the emperor?
Yes. is very important, quite a common development. When a Roman aristocrat didn't have an heritable son, he would hire somebody else to be adopted, and that person would be the inheritor of the family estates.
This is when Nero transforms himself from being Domitius. His full name is Tiberius Claudius Nero Drusus Germanicus Caesar. He becomes Nero. He is now being educated by a very famous Stoic who writes well, who is witty. No matter how many you kill, you can't kill your successor. I think that's wonderful, Anthony.
Great line.
Yes, it is. We should remember that in our politics here in the 21st century.
Yes.
Especially during these days of world fear. So Agrippina now has a son who is eligible to be successor to Claudius, but she has a rival in Britannicus who's actually the son of. But as you say, the Romans regarded adoption as good as birth because it's so difficult to concern yourself with medical practices in those days. There were so many births that were not successful, and children died young. Now, the detail also, we need to pay attention to Seneca because he's teaching the two words you emphasize, pietas and virtus. Pietas is loyalty, duty, and respect. Virtus is manliness, bravery, character. Did Nero believe those? Did he take the lessons well?
Hard to say. I would hazard a guess that he resisted. What he wanted to do was go out at night and get drunk and annoy the local population. He wasn't very concerned in his teens with the proprietors.
Also, I learned from you that the Stoics, maybe all the Romans, disdained popular entertainment. Much like, say, the 19th century, my reading disdained the actors or people who were on the stage as disreputable, and they were always worried about them. Did Seneca disdain performance?
Yes, he didn't like spectacle. He didn't like the arena, the deaths in the arena. He was interested in the higher arts rather than the common popular pursuits.
All right, it's 54 AD now, and Agrippina has decided to make her move. And the story again turns theatrical. It's about mushrooms. Anthony, I don't want to tell this story because it's not believable. How is it that Agrippina plans and does murder Claudius, the emperor of the Roman Empire?
He loves mushrooms, and she arranged for a dish of his favorite mushrooms to be brought forward, one of which was the most juicy looking, and she ate another one, so rather sort of tested the propriety of the food, and he, of course, snaffled up the delicious looking one, which didn't really work very well. But as he always got drunk and always got vomited in the evening, nobody was particularly worried. A second dose apparently was somehow administered, and he expired.
So we think they poisoned him twice, and they is Agrippina and Locusta. Do I remember that correctly?
She seems to be a sort of chemist, who a sort of pharmacist, who the sideline offered useful poisoning services to discontented wives.
No one is much told that Claudius is dead. They take him to the funeral pyre right away, put his ashes in an urn. However, several days later, theatrically again, Agrippina arranges it so that Nero appears in the emperor's purple, and Britannicus is not much to be seen. Nero at 54 AD, he's a very young man. You can do the calculations. He's 16, 17 years old. Is now the emperor of the Roman Empire with his mother. When we come back, with Agrippina now understood as the threat to the Roman Empire. And after the first 5 years, Nero removes her in a fashion we've described. What is Nero's threat then with his mother off the stage? The book is Nero, Matricide, Music, and Murder in Imperial Rome. Anthony Everitt and Roddy Ashworth are the authors. If it appears that the bodies are falling quickly, you're correct. But the major threat is to anyone close to the family that rules Rome, and also people who are hangers-on to that family. The succession drama is always the threat. We've seen that with Tiberius, who's suffocated by Caligula, who's murdered by the guards, and perhaps as a plot of his uncle, Claudius, and then Claudius himself is poisoned by Agrippina. We now come to the first 5 years of Nero as a teenager, as emperor of Rome. Anthony, I get the impression that his escapades at night with his gang, very immature and not especially damaging to the empire. At this point, Seneca, Burrus, and one other, freedmen, are ruling the empire. And are things going well, Anthony?
Yes, things are proceeding quite smoothly, quite satisfactorily. As long as Nero doesn't interest himself too much in the details of government. For the time being, he likes having a good time. He's a bit like Boris Johnson, if you know what I mean. Enjoys frivolity and alcohol.
And Seneca endorses this, Burrus endorses this. They
put up with it. They don't endorse it so much as they put up with it. It leaves them free to run the empire.
Yes, and he doesn't run the empire. He runs his own life. Now, there's a personality division here that we need to emphasize. It's not been obvious up to this point. Agrippina's dead in 59, but between 54 and 59, she's co-ruler of the empire. She makes a lot of decisions along with Seneca and Burrus. Her son, however, when he's not being frivolous, is keen on being a performer, and he trains on musical instruments. He trains his voice. He studies Greek poetry and Greek theater. And that's what at this point, is he entertaining the idea of becoming a performer and an actor? Or is that later, Anthony?
It's what he really wants. Throughout his life, he really wanted to be a professional musician in Alexandria. That would be his absolute ideal. I mean, he obviously didn't resist being emperor because it's a prize. But if he'd been given a real choice, that's what he would probably have done. That's what he would have done. He also just enjoyed being a teenager, out of control. I mean, that is great fun if you're a teenager with those opportunities.
Everything comes to 59, however, and the death of Agrippina, which liberates, I'm told, the young Nero to be his own kind of emperor, to pursue what he wants to do. One of the things he has rivalry with his mother about is the young women he takes up with. One is a freedman, perhaps a previous slave, Acta, whom Agrippina dislikes intensely, saying, "My daughter-in-law, the housemaid," and other harsh things. Pompeia we've met, and they're going to be, and Octavia is Nero's wife. She is royal. However, does he disdain her? Does she disdain Nero? They don't seem to have anything in common.
They can't stand each other, and they're sexually not very compatible as far as we can tell.
And that is the succession drama. I've emphasized that the succession drama is always coming up in the first century AD, and it will continue for the balance of the Roman Empire for 15 centuries. So the imperial model, the imperial business plan, I believe, Anthony, in between telling these wonderful stories, that's a primary weakness. Is that correct?
Yes. And it was only solved temporarily by the Emperor Hadrian, who decided to adopt a son and then make that son adopt another one. So there were 3 generations in which the decision on the succession had been taken. The awful thing was when no decision was taken and that you never knew. one of the great difficulties with Nero in his time was that there were so many people with Augustus's blood running in their veins. The crucial thing was to be related somehow to Augustus, then he might have a chance of becoming emperor. Well, quite innocent people happened to have the drops of Augustus' blood in them, and they were sitting ducks for Nero, paranoid and worried that he was going to be turfed out. He was going to be by one of these other descendants of Augustus.
Which
So
is what is happening right now. We're trying to get to the succession drama, and here it is. Nero sees rivals everywhere. Burrus dies naturally. It looks like cancer. Nero names a new Praetorian Guard leadership. One is a soldier, the other is Tigellinus, who we met earlier, although I didn't mention it, as someone who took up with Agrippina, perhaps earlier on when he was living simply in the Greek islands. But he's now one of the leaders of the Praetorian Guard, and he's an enforcer. He works directly with Nero. They celebrate their own power. They can celebrate it in games, always spectacular games, artificial lakes, gladiator contests, the murder of criminals in front of an entertaining gang. Yes, Tigellinus becomes the enforcer, and immediately we learn that Octavia is either infertile or nothing is happening. So Nero needs to replace her, but he's worried about being replaced by himself. He seems to pick out men whom he regards jealously, as Sulla and Plautus are both men murdered. Why did he pick them out of all the people around him?
They were leading members of the Stoic opposition. That was the real reason. And they had the drops of Augustus' blood in their veins, and they had to be put away. Even they had no intention of revolting themselves. They could be used as a sort of as a standard bearer unknowingly by other people, other conspirators. So it's better safe than sorry, Nero said to himself.
And then he has Octavia murdered. Couldn't he just divorce her? Did he have to go all the way?
It's very hard to say. I think that by that stage, their relationship has got so terrible that he just wanted her out of the way permanently. He just really couldn't stand the sight of her.
All right, it is now in the 60s. We're in the 60s, and the drama, which has been nothing but a serial homicide through the first 5 and now 6 years into it is about to turn to the Roman Empire in general, and the challenge of maintaining the army and loyalty and raising money to pay for all of it, taxes, of course, and dealing with the Senate that disregards Nero for all the reasons above, and the population of Rome that celebrates Nero because of the games, because of his personality, because he entertains them. He's witty, or as Anthony mentions, a former prime minister of Britain, very entertaining, not especially keen on the empire. The book is Nero. Anthony Everitt and Roddy Ashworth are the authors. When we come back, Boudica. We move from the stage set of Rome itself across the Roman Empire to Britain, Great Britain today. But to the Romans, this was the far edge of the world, the far edge of the empire. And the capital was Camulodunum, which modern Colchester, where Anthony Everitt and Roddy Ashworth speak these days. 2,000 years ago, however, it was the center of Roman rule. And the ruler in Rome needed money collected from the barons of the tribes. That deal caused upset everywhere across the land, especially to the man charged with collecting from the local barons. They changed deals. That's what he did. Instead of granting lands, he started taxing the land, saying it was just a rental or a lease. The British tribes, the Britons, didn't like the deal being changed, didn't want to pay their taxes. So the Camulodunum accountant sent out some bully boys to collect the taxes. They persecuted and then brutalized one particular tribe, the Iceni, And therein lies the story of a woman who is enormously famous in Britain and not yet as famous in America, but it's coming. Her name is Boudica. Roddy, thank you very much. What do we need to know about Boudica? What do we know about the Queen of the Iceni?
Unfortunately, not as much as we'd like to. We don't know if she was born an Iceni. She may have come from a foreign kingdom. There'd been a revolt some years before between the governor of Britain and this tribe, the Iceni, and it seems that after that, whoever was king then was removed, and a guy called Prasutagus was appointed as king, and his wife was Boudica. But it's all a bit strange. When Prasutagus dies, he's decided that he's going to leave half of his will to Nero, in a way to placate him, I suppose, and the other half to his two daughters. And obviously the question is, why didn't he leave any money to his wife? And we don't know why. It's not unusual for people that wasn't accustomed to leave the money to their daughters, but it was accustomed to leave them to the wife, particularly among the what we could call the continental Europeans. So there's something going wrong there, and she's certainly not very happy when the Romans, when her husband dies, this is Prasutagus, she's not very happy because the Romans decide that all the gold that they've lent these nearby tribes wasn't, as you said, a gift, but was in fact a loan, which is nonsense, really. And also, unfortunately, that shadowy figure Seneca is in the background, lent an enormous amount of gold, and suddenly decided he wanted it all back, which is not the way that Romans lent money to people. Unfortunately, they would invest in villas and, well, I mean, I say invest, they would force the locals to build villas and schools and other things that you couldn't turn back into gold. So you're right, this procurator who's in charge of the Britain of the province only because there is a war going on in the west of England, in Wales. So he's in charge, and he suddenly thinks, how am I going to turn all this money into gold when the money's been invested in things like schools and cats and dogs and pigs? I mean, it just isn't gold. You know, there's not enough to go around in terms of cash. So yes, he invents a rather unpleasant policy of suddenly changing all the money that was given. And I think Tacitus says to the best and most foremost Britons, in other words, to become client states. And he says that, he suddenly says, oh no, that was just a loan and we want it all back. He's got himself in a credit crunch, basically. Seneca wants his money back. He hasn't got the gold, so he has to get the gold from somewhere.
There's a war going on, not the least because the Roman legions are attempting to suppress the Druids, whom they fear. The Romans were frightened of many parts of the magic of the Druids. And today there's not a lot of clarity, but the Druids were powerful players moving between the tribes of Britain. The story is enormous. We're going to concentrate on Boudica. The Catus Decinicus is the green eye shade who sends 500 or so men to collect money that doesn't much exist. The Iceni resist, and these men marauders, and they attack Boudica's daughters. Boudica herself survives, but Boudica is now enraged, raises an army of the Iceni and the Trinovantes, and marches on you, Roddy. She marches right on you, Camulodunum. Now, at this point, had the Romans experience with suppressing the tribes? Did they know what was going to happen?
No, and they should have done, because the Trinovantes, who used to sometime 50 or 60 years ago, Camulodunum used to be their land, and the Romans had taken it over from a previous unpleasant occupant. The Romans had taken it over, but they seemed very relaxed about the Trinovantes. They just thought they were peasants, really, and so they didn't have any city walls. They didn't have any defences to speak of. And what's more, originally it had been home to a legion called Legion 20. And the legion would have been had the legion been there, I think Boudica might have been stopped in her tracks. But unfortunately, there were probably only about 200, maybe 300 town guard. So what happened next was rather unpleasant.
Now, Boudica means to wipe the Romans from the face of the earth. That's
Correct.
what's so impressive about her. She gives an order to these two large groups moving with women and children and cattle. They're moving in as a gigantic team to wipe out Camulodunum, including the temple built to Claudius. And is there a statue? I don't remember. Is it a statue of Nero or a statue of Claudius they destroy?
There's a statue, the statue of, well, archaeologists vary. There's been a big museum, a big exhibition in Britain about Nero a few years ago, and so they decided the statue was of Nero. I imagine when they do one on Claudius, they'll decide it's Claudius. I mean, it's one of those things. It's always been thought of to be Claudius, but having said that, it doesn't look much like either of them, so it's very difficult to know. But he falls on his front anyway. The Statue of Victory falls on his front with his back to the town,
Right.
which is seen as being a sort of terrible portent of doom.
Men, women, children, dogs, cats, the whole town is wiped off the face of the earth, burned to the ground.
Absolutely. It's burnt to the ground by the Iceni and the Trinovantes. There's one place they can hide in, which is a huge temple, really big temple. I mean, it's about the same size as you'd get in Rome, very ornate building. And they put about 800, 900 people in there. But the Trinovantes had built it. They'd been forced to build it. And they were also forced to pay for it, which is one of the reasons they were particularly annoyed. And it seems that what they did was they got up the sides. And of course, they knew the building backwards. And took some slates off the roof and then poured in boiling tar and stuff and burnt it from the inside. It's a horrible idea, really, if you think about it, because everybody would have suffocated in the smoke, all being burnt to death, which is really quite an unpleasant thought.
Boudica marches on Londinium and does the same thing because the Roman army decides that it can't fight there. It retreats to pick a battlefield. The Roman army is confronting perhaps 70,000, perhaps more. The numbers are very inexact. It's a spectacular scene. It's known as the Battle of Watling Street. The Romans are badly damaged by Boudica, but do we believe she committed suicide or was died of wounds? What do we know, Roddy?
It's very difficult because we've only got two classical sources on this. And one suggests that she took poison, and the other suggests that she died very quickly after a small illness, which, I mean, I think most people would interpret as being an infected wound of some sort.
The rising of Boudica in 61 AD is a measure of what it is to conduct an empire in 2,000 years ago. Boudica very much challenges the superiority of the Roman army. Do they regard it as success when they defeat her, or are they badly intimidated?
No, it's rather, I mean, I think the word intimidated probably wouldn't be right, but they were shocked. I mean, they couldn't believe that that such a thing could happen. I mean, Britain was a prized possession for the Romans. It was a way of showing off to the Greeks and everybody around in continental Europe. Look, we got Britain. You guys didn't even think it existed, and now we've got it. So, of course, to almost lose it was a disaster. And apart from anything else, it was a PR disaster as far as Nero was concerned. Having said that, he briefly did consider pulling out of Britain. And if he had done that, then neither you nor I would be sitting here today. If we were, we certainly wouldn't be speaking English, and our court systems would be completely different. But he doesn't do that. He decides, partly in the name of Claudius, really, that it would be cowardly, and that he would not be. He would lose a lot of face, and he would not be regarded in the way that he was before. So he decides to stay there. But no, it's very messy, because most of them are slaughtered on the field. And because this wasn't an army as such, I mean, there were some warriors at the front, on the front line, but behind them were butchers and bakers and, you know, farmers. And so when the Romans really get into the meat of the men, then they're really pretty incapable. But because they were so excited at leaving and bringing this army to Rome, they didn't plant any crops in their native lands. So when they went back, not only were they very beaten up, and although they were virtually being annihilated, but when they went back to their lands, those who could, there was no food. So there was a famine, and then the Romans came back after them and slaughtered more or less the lot.
2,000 years later, we celebrate Boudica for rising up against the invaders, the Roman Empire, led by Nero at this moment. The book is Nero, Matricide, Music, and Murder in Imperial Rome. It's time to go back to Rome and the plots around Nero, especially connected with his behavior. Anthony Everitt, Roddy Ashworth are the authors. It is 64 AD, summer in Rome, a city crowded, never built in any fashion to sustain fires that are routine here and there and everywhere in the crowded neighborhoods, except a fire begins near the Circus Maximus and spreads. Anthony, the fire spreads because, or despite, the efforts of the firefighters. Do we know today, because there are accusations that they did this to destroy the city so Nero could burn it? Is he guilty or innocent?
He's innocent, quite more than innocent. He's actually a very effective sorter out of the problems after the fire was over. The fact is that people put rumors, malevolent rumors about the fire, mistaking what were fire breaks, the building of fire breaks, mistaking that for people, the soldiery, purposely setting fires, and that's not true. It's far more. It's quite clearly an effort to create fire breaks. Nero was blamed for the fire, largely because there's nobody else around to blame. In fact, he handled the whole thing very well. He redesigned the city. He organized improvements to the public environment.
Nero is blamed for the fire. His response is to rebuild Rome with marble and with the golden house. But Nero blames the Christians, or does he? I'm careful of all of this because the distortion after 2,000 years can be enormous. Does Nero say this sect of Jews is responsible?
Well, he seems to, but in fact, there's good evidence that the section of the text in Tacitus that goes into all of this is in fact written by somebody completely different 3 or 4 centuries later. And that's quite crucial because Nero has a very bad reputation for persecuting Christians. It was supposed, for example, that he turned Christians into human torches in order to light an evening garden party. Not true, made up, but in the 5th century by a Christian apologist.
So what we have so far is Nero didn't set the fire. Nero didn't burn Christians on crucifixes to light his garden while he plays he played an instrument that's not quite a fiddle. But in any event, he didn't do that. And Nero didn't set the fire on purpose to wipe out the population. He favored the population. He was far more popular with the common people than he was with the Senate. And Nero rebuilt. What is the Golden House, Anthony?
The Golden House is in fact a fun palace, a people's palace. It's an enormous set of buildings and green fields and farms and who knows what. It was a complete sort of architectural system. Now, his critics suppose that he built this palace in order to live there. He didn't live there, he lives on the Palatine. His idea for the Golden House was to have a palace that was open to the people. So it's quite among the people, it's quite a popular thing. It was the culmination of his policy of spectacle, which guided his domestic policy.
And a detail about the burning of the city. Is that in the sources? We have 30 seconds here. Is that in any particular sources that say that this happened, that this was Nero, or was that at the time? Did Tacitus, did Suetonius, did Dio, did they say that?
They tended to blame, Tacitus leaves it open as to whether or not it was true.
Nero, matricide, music, and murder in Imperial Rome. If you think it's over much so far, here we go. The conspirators. Piso is a man who has everything in life in 1st century AD Rome. He's a poet, he's a Stoic, he's well-to-do, he's married to a woman he loves, though she's not elite as he is. He knows Nero. Nero spends time at his villa, and yet, Anthony, this conspiracy, it arises out of what? Alienation from Nero? Money? What drives it?
Well, you could say almost that Agrippina's disappearance drives it, because Agrippina understood the compromises of politics and Nero didn't. And Nero's unwillingness to compromise built up a resentment among the senatorial class. And it was that class where the members of the conspiracy were recruited.
The recruitment is lackadaisical, as Anthony and Roddy write, half-hearted, and it takes a long time, and everybody knows about it.
It seems to happen.
Yes.
It seems to happen.
And so we come to the moment itself. There's no drawn out, there's no great plot, there's not a lot of thinking going on here. One man is sharpening his dagger. His freedman notices this and says, "Why are you sharpening a dagger all of a sudden?" For reasons we can't entirely understand, this freedman then takes it to Nero via one of Nero's retainers. He actually speaks to Nero that day. It's the day before the plan was to be executed. And Nero has been suspicious for some time. He's actually, in fact, tortured somebody whom he heard was involved in the plot, a Greek woman who resisted the torture and stood up. In other words, deceived the emperor. But now he has new information, and he begins a purge with Tigellinus, who is his enforcer. The purge is vast, Anthony.
Yes.
It eventually reaches everybody. Is it the Stoics he despises? Is that a theme for him in the purge?
Well, yes, I think it is. I think it is, because the Stoics are responsible for all the difficulties that are being laid in his way.
And it reaches not only Piso, who will commit suicide, it reaches Seneca. And herein we return to Seneca's personality, which was informative of the young Nero. You write very carefully that Seneca had in mind the death of Socrates, and that he had a dinner party in front of him. Seneca is a performer. He's a very wealthy man. He's extremely contradictory. He's tried to retire from being the emperor's assistant or the emperor's guide, not very successfully. What do you make of Seneca's death? how to regard it 2,000 years later.
It was a brave death. And once he knew that it was inevitable, that he was going to be compelled by the emperor to commit suicide, he accepted it. But he did more than accepted it. He made it into a performance. He made it into a kind of drama. He made sure that everything he said was on the famous last words for variety. Whereas if you compare him with Socrates, as he was comparing his own performance with Socrates, if you compare him with Socrates, the mood is much more natural, much less artificial. So even when he gets it right, Seneca can't quite get it right.
The deaths of Stoics are always informed by the death of Cato, which took place more than a century before, well, about a century before, during the Roman Civil War. And I mention that because Seneca is in his seniority when he commits suicide as a Stoic, but in his youth is Lucan, the great Roman poet, who's written a long poem of the Civil War that is celebrated at the time. It's so successful that Nero is jealous, envious, disdainful of Lucan. Is Lucan part of the plot, to your knowledge, Anthony?
Yes, he was, but he was cowardly. He betrayed his mother in a hope of escape. And yes, quite wrong. However, he wrote a very good line about Cato. Victrix causa diis vacuit, said Victor Catoni. The gods favored the winning side of the Civil War, but Cato favored the losers.
Oh, yes, you remind me now. I smiled because I recently read a book about Cato, and I thought I didn't have this irony when I was celebrating Cato. You know, in America, we celebrated Cato in the 18th century, the founding fathers of America. Very
Which
much
Cato, the younger one or the suicide
younger one, Cato the Younger. His sacrifice for the Republic was very much in George Washington's mind, I'm told.
Cicero didn't have any time for him, by the way. He saw him as a kind of Norman Mailer, I suspect. He said the thing about Cato, Cicero said, is that instead of he thinks he's living in Plato's Republic instead of Rome's cast away excrement.
What we have here is we're dealing in 2 centuries, but it's in the mind of these men all the time. Did Seneca expect his death to be conveyed to Nero as a repudiation? What did Seneca think his pupil?
Oh, yes, Nero was not far away and was actually sending instructions via a military tribune, an army officer. They knew all about it.
This is the first half of 65. Remember, with the fire in 64, the purges in 65, and now Nero goes home one night and murders Pompeia. What do we make of this, Anthony? Why?
Well, it may have been an accident. He may have lost his temper with her and gave her a good kicking, and which precipitated a miscarriage as she was pregnant, and then her death.
And it's like, it reminds me of the death of Agrippina. Immediately afterwards, he's mournful and regretful and haunted.
Can't forgive himself. He's covered with guilt.
And then he launches a second wave of purges, this time to take down, well, didn't he towards the end of his life, he wanted to kill all the generals, all the senators?
Well, yeah, I think that was said in a fit of rage. But there's one very important thing about the conspiracy, which is that a number of very close friends and associates of Nero were implicated, and that horrified him. He'd taken these friends on their terms and was mortified that they had betrayed him.
All right, here's a man who doesn't have a mother, who doesn't have a successor. He murders his wife while she's pregnant. He's led to the purge of everyone around him who was educated in his time or a part of his class. The only man he actually deals with is a sadist, Tiberius. And what does he do? What would you do after all of this? How about going on a tour of Greece to be celebrated and win the Olympic Games? Anthony,
good.
what is wonderful about history, especially Roman history, is you could never get away with this in a novel. Never.
Perfectly true. Perfectly true. Yes. And then he's been longing to go to Greece for ages, and now he has the ideal opportunity.
And he wants to win all the contests. He wants to win the Olympic contests. He wants to win the performances. Now, do the Greeks fear voting him second the way the Romans do? In other words,
yes.
Oh,
he wins all the prizes at the Olympic Games and all the other games. All the other games they happen in different years, so there's a spread them out. For this year, when they knew that Nero was coming, they moved all the games to happen in that given year. And he won first prize, even when he collapsed and wasn't able to finish. He still won first prize. He nearly killed himself driving a chariot in a race.
Yes, he won. He was a chariot racer. I beg pardon. I've bypassed that. He both wants to be a performer on the stage, acting out poetry, singing songs, and to drive a 10-horse chariot in races. He's done this for his whole life. He's several people in one person. But what is his voice? What is his presentation? Are there any details that we have through the sources? What's he like as a singer?
Moderate, probably. We can't tell. We don't know because his critics all said he was rubbish. But the popular opinion was that he was not bad. One suspects he was a sort of middle of the road pop singer, pop star.
And how was he as a charioteer? Were there any sources who said that the races were fixed? Anything like that?
No, I don't. It's difficult to fix a chariot race. So it's genuinely dangerous, and he very nearly copped it.
Now, he's not a modern person, so I'm not going to use psychology here. I just wonder if this combination, you've worked with him a long time in the Latin sources about him. He seems to be a person whose personality can change from year to year, day to day, week to week. Was it like that living with him? You never knew.
I suspect it was. I think he is probably rather a simple person. I think he's probably rather naive, despite all the opportunities for becoming wise in the world.
He tours Greece from 66 to 68, and then he hears there's trouble. Boy, is there trouble. In Gaul, as a matter of fact, a man named Vindex is rising up against the Romans, just the way Boudica did. But in this instance, Vindex recruits Roman governors and generals to rise up against Nero. What is Vindex's complaint of the emperor? He's a Gaul. He's not Roman.
Yes, but he developed some of the ideas of an ancient Roman member of the Republic, and he casts himself as an ancient Roman, and that's his motive. He disapproves of the empire because it constrains the liberties of the subject.
What's in the immediate future is what is called the Year of 4 Emperors. We're not going to go that far because this will be the end of the Julian-Claudian line. Nero is the exit. And the exit of Nero is instructive in that Nero all of a sudden was surrounded by no friends whatsoever, not even his household guards. He hears that they're coming for him. He believes it. And Anthony, I had the impression that it was all in his mind, that he was being chased by ghosts. Is that something like his end? There was nobody actually ready to execute him. He just exaggerated what could happen.
He, like Seneca, his tutor and then his enemy, he wanted to stage his death as a performance, a spectacle.
Were they planning to kill him the way he thought they were? Was the Senate bold enough to do that, to execute him?
Yes. They condemned him as a public enemy.
I see. So when he fled to the suburbs, it's all very dramatic again. He flees to the suburbs and he's with the least of them. He's not with anyone of his class whatsoever. He's with
a senior freedman and one or two others, and Sporus of all people stays loyal despite all that had been done to him.
And he stabs himself in the throat with a knife
with assistance from Epaphroditus.
In the throat. That's what I took. In the
Yes.
throat. In other words, he goes after his voice box.
Oh, that's interesting. I'd not thought of that. Yes, very good.
Well, he's a Hollywood script. I'm figuring he's always thinking this through, unless it was just he's just spontaneously dramatic.
I think that's right. I'm sure you're right.
There's no end to Nero except for there he is dead. Galba, a man who will not survive more than a few months before. Well, it's a series of emperors that eventually lead to Vespasian. And what I like about Vespasian is that he was early on. It's like in a movie, you want to introduce the end of the movie somewhere in the first act. Vespasian, what is it, a breakfast table with the young Nero? I don't remember where they.
He drops off during one of Nero's performances.
And Vespasian is sent to solve the Jewish revolt with Nero not really caring that much about it. But Vespasian and his son Titus, he leaves Titus behind. Those of us who...
The Vespasian was that he couldn't apply for the succession. He was too dull and too ordinary and too junior. And that's why Nero appointed him, because he wouldn't be a danger, political danger to him.
And of course, that's exactly what he becomes after Rome is burned again. There's a fire again in 69, but that's in the future. Nero's dead. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the sources. So much of the opinion of Nero in the 21st century depends upon the writers who have over several centuries told this story. The book is Nero, Matricide, Music, and Murder in Imperial Rome. Anthony Everitt and Roddy Ashworth are the authors. It is now 69 AD, and Rome has another fate, 4 emperors, and eventually the Flavians will take charge for the balance of this century. But we're concerned with who tells us about Nero. Anthony Everitt and Roddy Ashworth are here. Anthony, we've talked about Tacitus, who's a scold and disdainful of much of Nero's life. Suetonius, I don't have a way of picturing his opinion, or Dio. Did they all have different points of view, and did they read each other?
But yes, they probably did. The greatest of all of those that you mentioned is Tacitus. He's a great literary artist. We have a great deal of his work surviving, which is good. While he excuse me, while Tacitus exaggerates, he never knowingly tells a lie, and so you can depend on him, even if the interpretation that he gives on a given incident or event is not one that you would share. Suetonius is a gossip and just piles lots of interesting little anecdotes in no particular order. Dio Cassius is a senator from 2 centuries later, and he's as good as his sources. Sometimes he's good, sometimes he's bad.
Yes, he's the second and third century. It's from the 2nd into the 3rd century. So he can read the original Tacitus and the original Suetonius.
Yes. Well, you need to be, yes, he can. But the greatest of them all is, without a doubt, Tacitus. Tacitus is the historian I want to go to my grave with, rather than Suetonius and Dio Cassius.
Now, we've talked about Seneca, who is witty. I understand that he constructs things to make himself look good, but he's very clever, extremely clever. Petronius is the author of Satyricon, I think. And yeah. I wanted to mention Satyricon here because so much of You Can't Make This Stuff Up is Satyricon, and it looks like Nero spent time imitating Satyricon. Or what did Satyricon imitate Nero? What was the order of battle here?
I thought the former. The Satyricon is an amazing book. It's an unfinished novel. In fact, it's a very early novel, and it's set in low life Italy. And it gives a completely different view of the Roman world. It's a brilliant book, extremely funny, very racy, not to be encouraged to your maiden aunt, but it's a great work of art. And I speculate that Nero will have admired the escapades of Petronius's characters. Petronius was a well-known figure at court. He was very elegant, very fashionable, always wearing the latest fashions.
And Nero, did Nero approve of him the way differently than he was a rival with Lucan? Was he a rival with Petronius?
I think that he and my suspicion is that he and Petronius got on very well in the back streets late at night, having fun.
Two more. Pliny the Elder, who was vaguely contemporary. Yes, he was exactly contemporary. Do we believe that his version of these events are trustworthy?
He's famous for writing an enormous ragbag of an encyclopedia. Some of the stuff is rubbish. Some of the stuff is extremely interesting, very interesting, telling anecdotes about Nero and his time.
He dies in Vesuvius in 79.
He does.
Yes, and let's see, Plutarch, he tells some of the stories, but just a few anecdotes. He doesn't spend time with Plutarch. He writes about Galban Otho, who will be two of the four emperors in 69.
He writes an amusing essay about Hitler. I'll start again. He writes an amusing essay about Nero after death, where he turns into a frog and is able to sing frog-like for the rest of eternity.
2,000 years later, Nero, matricide, music, and murder in Imperial Rome. Anthony Everitt and Roddy Ashworth are the authors. None of this is predictable. None of it. I recommend. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.